I've been reflecting on the nature of technology recently, and it dawned on me that language was really the first internet. And you might be thinking, oh, this should be good. Let's hear this explanation. But I promise you that I think there's something to this. I was imagining a time, an ancient time, many, many generations ago, before language existed, and envisioning, well, how would communication have taken place before we had what we know today as language? And it just so happened that right around this time I heard some birds start chirping, and there's birds chirping right now outside as I say that. And for those of you who have done any sort of investigation into the communication system that birds use, you know that while to us it just sounds like chirping, to them it's actually a very sophisticated language. It's a sophisticated communication system that they use to tell each other what's going on and everything else that usually comes with a communication system. So I was thinking, well, maybe we were kind of like birds chirping in a sense. We had our own way of communicating with each other that would have just been noises coming out of our vocal cords that to an outside observer might seem like birds chirping at each other. To an outside observer, it might seem pointless. What are these creatures doing? They're just chirping. Surely it doesn't mean anything. But to us, those sounds would be very complex. There would be nuance to the chirps, as it were. Certain chirps would mean one thing, and it might sound the same to someone who wasn't familiar with our communication system, but it would actually be very in-depth. At some point along the way, whatever the original communication system was, no longer remained useful, to the point where a different communication system was invented and or seeded to us, depending on how you view who we are, where we come from, why we're here. And this started in what are referred to as hieroglyphics, various symbols that were used to put down meaning somewhere other than what was just being inflected out of the vocal cords. This was a way to record meaning, in other words, record a communication system. Because if you think about it, before there was language, there would be no way to record birds chirping to save it for posterity's sake, right? I mean, that thought wouldn't even cross your mind. You would be completely in the moment, communicating through the chirps, living moment to moment, and any sort of history would be of a vocal variety that was passed down generation to generation through storytelling. And before there was language, it just would have been sort of a shared experiential storytelling that would have been done intuitively, and you can imagine perhaps that this quote-unquote primitive communication style would be exchanging images, mind to mind. What would be referred to as telepathy now, but what would have been completely normal back then as a way to communicate scenes from one person to another. Making noises, chirping as a sort of way to communicate various things, but then the true communication would be taking place mind to mind, sharing images with each other, sharing feelings in that way. And then, like I said, at some point, either someone had the aha moment of, oh, let's take these images that are in our minds that we are sharing with each other, and let's create symbols that we can put down somewhere and then use to communicate with everybody who has access to these symbols. And in doing so, we can take all of these images that are in our minds and we can save them somewhere so that we have a history. Again, was this a natural idea? I don't know. Is this something that you would think of if you were in that situation? I don't know. In any event, slowly over time, the hieroglyphs evolve to the point where written languages are produced that are very complex. And this process exemplifies how language itself was the first internet. But in order to see that, you have to go through the chain of logic that created the internet, which was a similar process and kind of derived from the invention of the telephone and the television. In other words, as this language system became more and more complex, we became less and less connected to any sort of intuitive, natural, image-based communication between each other that might be referred to as some form of telepathy. I mean, telepathy is always thought of as, oh, I'm going to put a thought in your mind, but that's not quite what it is. Or alternatively, I'm going to see inside your mind and control it in some way, right? That's the Professor X version of it from the X-Men. But no, it's not that you can read someone's mind and control it. It's just we have access to each other's minds because it's a part of our natural communication system. In the sense that I can intend to transmit an image to your mind, and then you see that image in real time. Now, sure, if I had a less than pure intent, maybe you could put images in someone's mind that was designed to evoke certain feelings and control them in some way, right? I mean, you can imagine all kinds of permutations in that direction, but originally that's not what it would have been about. That's a product of the situation that we're in now, where that kind of thing would even be thought of, and then you take it to the extreme of like remote neural monitoring or something along those lines. Where, like the story that I'm going to get into now, someone took that idea and created a technology that mimics it and can be used for nefarious purposes. But anyway, as language evolved and we became less and less connected to that natural communication system or process, someone disconnected looked at the situation and said, man, I would really like to be able to transmit language or meaning to someone that doesn't live next door to me or right down the street from me or who I don't see on an everyday basis. I wish there was a way that I could communicate with them through some device. And of course, you would think it would have to be done through a device because at this point you've lost any connection to the fact that this is actually possible in your mind. So given that situation, someone allegedly comes up with the idea for the telephone and creates a crude first version of it that allows you to speak into a device, and then someone on the other end of the device can hear you. And then from this, the telephone is developed to the point where, okay, now we can talk in two different cities. And as the infrastructure continues to build, the communication system builds with it, and telephones become a very complex technology that allows people to call each other from different countries. Halfway across the world, you can talk to somebody. And that was just the first corded iteration of them, right? I'm not even talking about cellular telephones yet. And we could get into why they were called cellular telephones in a different context, but no need to go there right now. Well, at some point during this process, someone also had the idea, based on viewing the television, of, hey, wait a second, we have this device that can send my voice through these cables to a device in another place, and that person can hear my voice through this process. And we also have this device where images can be transmitted from information gathered together and then presented as an image on a screen. It's actually really interesting. They attribute the development of the television to a farmer who was plowing potatoes, I believe is the story. And anybody who's done this kind of work knows that potatoes are put in lines in a field, to where if you look at them, it just looks like little mounds right next to each other, lines of mounds going as far as the eye can see, right? And then you'd come through with the tractor and destroy the mound when the potatoes are ready, and then you got to go in and pick up all the potatoes. So anyway, this guy was plowing potatoes, and then he had this vision for, if I see a picture in a picture frame, I wonder if I could turn that picture into little lines and then feed those lines individually into a device that would recreate the lines as a image on a screen. And this is the idea for the television. I mean, that is the basis of it, but it's obviously way more complex than that now. But that's essentially what they're doing, right? They take little pieces of information that contain images, and then they put it onto the screen through the device at a rate that's so fast that it is viewed as a moving image to your eyes. Anyway, that's how the television was supposedly created. Or at least, that was the start of it. And then it was improved upon like most of these things. So someone is looking at that process in the context of the telephone networks, and they say, oh, okay, well, what if we could create a device that has a screen that would allow you to transmit information between the screens? In other words, it would be like the telephone and the television combined, to where I'd be able to transmit information through these cables from my screen to their screen. And that's how the internet was born. Now, the fact that this was started by ARPANET, as the story goes, is more layers to the story than what I'm getting into here, but you can see at least the ideological framework that existed, the plausible reasoning that existed for how this technology was created. And so I got into this story to explain, well, why was language the original internet? Well, hopefully you see kind of what I'm getting at now. At first, we had this natural communication system that might seem very primitive to those of us viewing it now, in the same way that we would look at birds ignorant of how complex it is. And we would only be able to see the manifestation of the communication system in the form of the chirping. We don't have any idea how the mind of the bird is actually communicating with other bird minds. They could be sharing images with each other, and we would label that as some sort of telepathy that can't be proven, right? Modern science would scoff at an idea like that, because modern science is disconnected from the world around it in the same way that everything else is. Indeed, modern science is a way for disconnection to try to explain its existence in the world, and that's why science is so closely related to atheism, because when you're looking at it from that perspective, there's no meaning to anything, you see? So ironically enough, language, hieroglyphs, that sort of communication was the first version of the internet, and it started the process of disconnecting us from each other. As we are becoming more connected objectively at the same time. Do you see the duplicity there? How hard it is to see that when you're experiencing what you feel like is more communication, more ability to interact. And indeed, we see this in the modern world through the way that we're more connected than ever to information, but increasingly we're more disconnected from those around us. I mean, you just look at a family today and the kids are constantly in their phone, and even I experience a little bit of this where over the holidays I'm in the same house as my family members, and one of my family members sent me a text message. I mean, I didn't have my phone on me because I never have it on me when I'm interacting with people. But they told me this, like, hey, why didn't you answer me? And I'm like, I don't have my phone on me. Why didn't you just come talk to me? I couldn't believe it. Why didn't you just come talk to me? We're in the same place. And then we got into this conversation like, well, in my household, we just text each other because it's easier. I couldn't believe this. And that's kind of what started this whole thought process that I was having and that I'm relaying to you now. But all of that aside, I hope you see how this ties into the increasingly prevalent idea that this reality is just a computer simulation. The computers and the internet in general are an externalization of something that was already naturally existing. It's just what a disconnected mind from creation created. Or alternatively, increasingly put into society as a way to further disconnect us. At some point, all of these cables were connecting everything, called an Ethernet connection, right? I mean, they put it all there in the terms. And someone said, oh, hey, what if we get rid of the cords and we could do this somehow wirelessly, send it from one device to another without any cords connecting it. And they call this Wi-Fi. But we have our own natural Wi-Fi. That's the irony of the situation. However, not knowing that, you look at the computer, you see what it does, and then you look at reality all around you and you say, oh, well, this must be a computer simulation. That's the only thing that makes sense now. And it's not that, it's just you're not viewing it in the full context to get the full picture of what's really going on. Now, I'll be the first to say, if I was in some sort of computer simulation, how would I know, right? I mean, that could easily be true. I'm just saying when you look at everything holistically, it becomes obvious that all of this technology was derived from something that has been withheld from us, something that we have forgotten. And then it's given back to us, and we think it's the coolest thing ever because it's tapping into our shared collective memories about a time when we used to communicate with each other in a way that was similar to this. I mean, that's what sending a text message to someone is, right? Someone who's not near you, someone who lives maybe many states away, you're able to communicate with them in a sense, telepathically, right? You're thinking of that person, you send them a message through this device, and then they receive it, and it's this magical thing that's taken place, but you could do that without the device, you just don't know that. It's just this ability that's been removed from our daily existence at this point. And it's so funny, the permutations of that, because sometimes you'll think of a person and you'll send them a message and then they respond back, oh my gosh, I was just thinking about you. Or, oh my gosh, I was just thinking about the thing that you texted me about. That's so crazy. It's like, well, yeah, because we're communicating and we just don't know it. And then it's manifested externally as this major coincidence that transpired through the technology, right? So in some ways, it's giving us windows into what's really going on. And that's so funny that I use the term Windows there, right? What did Bill Gates call his device? Windows. I mean, you could get into the naming of everything and how that's giving you clues to what's going on. But I mean, as I said in the last recording, the long con, there's an apple with a bite taken out of it on one of the devices, right? I mean, they told you. It's obvious. Taking this one step further, I'm going to envision an image in my mind. And I'm going to envision one of my favorite things in this reality, which is the beach. So I'm imagining the sand on my feet, the sound of the waves, the smell of the salt in the air, the sun on my skin, the breeze in my face, taking in that scene. The blue water, the white sand, the darker sand that's been exposed to the waves coming over it over and over again as you get closer to the water. Birds flying in the sky, swooping down occasionally to try and eat a fish, because that's this reality. What can you do? Right? I didn't create it. That kind of ruined my scene, actually, now that I think about it. But anyway, moving on. You get the idea, right? I'm envisioning this beach scene, and you listening to this are envisioning what I am relaying to you. Let's use an easy example and say that there is a snail that I've also imagined into existence on this beach. And it left one of its shells in the sand. And you walk over and pick it up, and you're looking at the shell and you see this beautiful pattern in it. And this gets you thinking, I wonder if this pattern is anywhere else in this beach scene. And then you start looking around and you notice, wow, there is this pattern that seems to be everywhere. Well, you might get to the point over many generations and many, many lifetimes of contemplation collectively in this beach scene where you say, I'm going to call this pattern the Fibonacci sequence. I'm going to put numbers to it. This is going to become mathematics eventually. And then there will be this whole body of literature that points to the creation as something that has to be artificial, because surely nothing on my level of intelligence would be able to create something this complex. And this is where the idea of reality being a simulation ultimately comes from. When you're examining the scaffolding of the creation by looking at its patterns, it seems too complex for anyone like you to create. But then you got to remember, something much more complex than your mind created it. And maybe this is semantics in a sense, but I hope you see how calling it an artificial simulation, a computer program, is the same thing as saying that this is the creation of a mind that had no intent of creating math and letting that be what guides your decision making. No, it just imagined this creation, and math is only a byproduct of it. It's just in the scaffolding of the creation by necessity. But it's not the secret of the creation, right? It's not going to give you any sort of further insight into who you are and where you come from. Indeed, as I alluded to earlier, following things strictly along those lines will lead you to thinking that there is no purpose to anything. It's just numbers. And then that gets you back to, why would the computer with its outward manifestation as technology of something that is innate within us from a long time ago, evoke those feelings within you that would make you see reality in ones and zeros. And then, of course, they play into all this by coming out with movies like The Matrix that supposedly give away this truth to detach you further. And I hope you see how that plays into what is planned in the future with the way that everything is being digitized. Because when you view the world in this way, there is no resistance or barrier to how far you should take it, right? You should just take it all the way because there's nothing else and there's no reason for you not to in that situation. Again, with my puny human mind, there's no way I would know if it's not a simulation. And in some ways, you could argue, hey, maybe this is your delusion where you're trying to place an intent behind the simulation. You're just replacing the creator for an alien with an iPad, right? And maybe I am doing that. I don't know. It's just a thought experiment. But hopefully, bringing all of this together in your mind, you can kind of at least not go all the way with full certainty towards the idea that, oh, this is just some kind of simulation and this is a 13th floor scenario where we're eventually going to build our own civilization. I don't know what that was. I tried to combine simulation and civilization. I was talking too fast. Where you try to build your own simulation that is a civilization. But on the flip side, consider the idea that the externalization of this communication ability, as seen through computers and phones and everything that's associated with them, might actually, in the long run, move us away from the very thing that they have planned for us and bring us back closer to this memory that we have of this natural communication system. And in the end, we either assimilate the technology in a much more healthy way and use it only in ways that don't control us and take us over and disconnect us, or we eventually discard it altogether because it reminds us, it triggers that memory within us, and we all start to communicate like we would have many, many generations ago before the invention of the first internet, which was written language. I don't know, just something to think about, right?